and thank you for joining me here today at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and I recently did a book versus movie video for Forrest Gump. If you have not watched that, you definitely should. But in that video, I mentioned that there is a book sequel to Forrest Gump titled Gump and Co. And I actually really enjoyed the book Forrest Gump, which is a controversial opinion because a lot of people hate the book and love the movie. But I actually enjoyed the book, so I was very curious to read the sequel. And since recording that video, I have read the sequel, so I thought I would make a video sharing my thoughts and telling you what happens. But first, something I meant to mention in my Forrest Gump video was, of course, the movie has the famous line, "Life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're gonna get." Like, there's a similar line in the book, but it is like the opposite. And it reads, "Let me say this, being an idiot is no box of chocolates." And so the book and movie Forrest Gump are very different, but this is funny because it's like the screenwriter saw this line and he's like, ooh, I like the idea of comparing life with a box of chocolates, but then he just took it and ran with it in a different direction. Like I said, that's the case with a lot of this movie because it is very different from the book. But I also wanted to say that the screenwriter for Forrest Gump is Eric Roth, and he is someone I recently talked about because he wrote the screenplay for Killers of the Flower Moon, which I also covered. So I will link to that in case you have not watched that video. But to talk about the book Gump and Co., I will be getting into spoilers for, of course, Forrest Gump, the book. So yeah, just be aware of that. And I'm also just going to get right into the plot details of Gump and Co. So super quick, spoiler free. I wouldn't recommend this one and I was disappointed by it. But from here on out, I'm going to be getting into spoilers. And I wanted to say also, in my Forrest Gump video, I said that Gump and Co. picked up where the movie left off rather than where the book Forrest Gump left off. And I said that because I read two different reviewers on Goodreads who said that. They said this book picked up where the movie left off, not the book. And I was like, wow, that's kind of weird, but I guess it makes sense since the movie was so popular. But that's not the case. This book picks up where the book Forrest Gump left off. So I have no idea why two different reviewers said that. Like, right off the bat, it's very obvious that this is picking up where the book left off, not the movie. So I apologize for spreading that false information because it was very untrue. Also, this book is not available on Kindle. You have to buy the physical copy. I was going to return this after I read it, but then my rabbit chewed up the edges. And so now I have to keep it or donate it. But anyway, so yeah, at the end of Forrest Gump, we leave Forrest with Lieutenant Dan and Sue the orangutan living in New Orleans, and they're just kind of street performers, and Forrest hangs out with this woman who owns a strip club named Wanda, and Gump and Co. picks up with Forrest in New Orleans, and he is like a janitor for Wanda's strip club, and he says that Lieutenant Dan and Sue have since left to go help run Bubba Gump, but that Bubba Gump has since gone bankrupt, and so he hasn't seen Lieutenant Dan or Sue since they left to go help run Bubba Gump, and people speculate that the two of them, as well as like everybody else, because his mom had died, by the way. So his mom was helping run Bubba Gump, but then she died, and after she died, he says is when people got corrupt and started stealing the money, and now he has nothing. So before, in Forrest Gump, he was living in New Orleans just because he wanted to, whereas now, like, he has no choice but to be like a janitor for a strip club because he has no other options to fall back on. But while he is at this strip club, an old college buddy shows up, a guy he used to play football with, and this football buddy, he recognizes him and he's like, "Forrest?" And he says how like, wow, like you have lived such a crazy life. Like, how is it that you ended up here being a janitor at a strip club? Like, that's wild. Like, you should be doing something more with your life. And I feel like that explains how a lot of readers felt reading Forrest Gump, because the ending of that book, you're just like, really? Like, that's how this crazy story is going to end? Like, it didn't seem to fit, really. So I feel like that friend saying that basically encompasses what a lot of readers felt. But anyway, from here, Forrest ends up becoming an NFL player because this friend plays for the New Orleans Saints and they're doing really bad. And he's like, we could really use someone like you. And so he starts working for the NFL. And from here is when Forrest goes on a series of adventures similar to the first book. However, in the first book, the events that happened were all very random and had no historical significance, really. Whereas this book is different. So the movie obviously is, takes you through history. And so the sequel, Gump and Co., does that as well, where like basically nearly everything Forrest experiences has historical significance. And I didn't even catch on to this until he mentions Reverend Baker and his wife Tammy Faye. And obviously The Eyes of Tammy Faye came out like last year or something. So I was like, wait a minute, she's a real person. And so then I like was Googling other things, and like a lot of this is like 1980s history, which I am not super well versed in. And so So you have the obvious things like the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I knew about, but there's other things mentioned that I didn't realize was a historical thing. But yeah, that's what this book does. Nearly everything that happens to Forrest has historical significance here. And I wasn't a fan of this. Like, it works in the movie, but I liked in the book, Forrest Gump, how just like random everything was. And it didn't feel contrived. It just felt random and silly. Whereas here, the events do feel more contrived and maybe a bit forced. But of course, I need to talk about Forrest Jr., also known as Little Forrest, who is Forrest Gump's son. Again, in Forrest Gump, we left off with Forrest knowing he had a son from Jenny, and Jenny is raising this son with another man whom she married. So he sends them money and he gets letters from her, but he isn't part of Forrest's life. However, in Gump and Co, when he is playing for the NFL, he gets a letter letting him know that Jenny and her husband got an illness and they died within a week of each other. And now Little Forrest is being raised by Jenny's mom. So she is the one writing Forrest, and she's also telling him, like, you know, I'm getting old and I'm pretty poor, so whatever help you can give us would be greatly appreciated. And from here, Forrest leaves the NFL to go meet up with Jenny's mom and Forrest Jr. And this is when Forrest Jr. is told, one, that his dad is dead because he didn't realize his dad had died. So they're like, your dad has died, and by the way, he wasn't your birth father. Me, Forrest, I am your birth father. And so poor Forrest Jr., that's a lot to take in, and he does not take it well. But from here, Forrest Gump is like, wow, like I need to find a decent job so I can help support Little Forrest and Jenny's mom. And so from here, Forrest becomes an encyclopedia salesman. And I'm just gonna like run through everything that happens right here, actually. So he becomes an encyclopedia salesman, and then he starts working for Coca-Cola to improve their recipe, which does not go well. And then he becomes a pig farmer, and this goes well for a while, and Little Forrest comes to spend the summer with him on this pig farm, and Forrest Jr. is like crazy smart, and he has all these great ideas. And so the pig farm is going amazing. However, once Forrest returns to school, Little Forrest, you know, of course, the crap hits the fan, as they say, quite literally here, because the town explodes they have like the pig feces down below in the ground, and then there's an explosion. So it's just like pig stuff everywhere. But anyway, so that happens. And then he is in the military. And then with Ronald Reagan, there was some like arms for hostages deal that happened. And so Forrest becomes part of that. And then he goes to jail. And then from jail, Reverend Baker gets these different inmates to help him create this like Holy Land theme park type place. And then from here, he then goes to New York City and gets involved with some guy named Ivan and insider trading. So then he's put on trial for insider trading because he was made to be the fall guy for it. And then after this, he again goes in the military and he is sent to Baghdad. And then there's this whole situation with Saddam Hussein where they like kidnap Saddam and they try to turn him over to the Americans, but then the Americans are like, wait, we don't want him. And so then they have to go return Saddam Hussein. And then while in the military after Baghdad, by the way, Lieutenant Dan and Sue were with him in Baghdad and they both die. The tank they were in explodes and Lieutenant Dan and Sue both die in this tank. But from there, he is shipped to Germany and he plays football for the army. And then while playing football in Germany, basically he causes the Berlin Wall to come down. And then eventually he is back in America and he starts an oyster company called Gump and Co. And then the oyster company becomes super popular, and similar to Forrest Gump, he hires a bunch of different people he has met through the course of this book, including Little Forrest, because Little Forrest, like I said, he is just very smart. And through the course of this book, his relationship with Little Forrest has been growing and improving. And, you know, they've had their down moments, but they've also grown closer. But yeah, so they start Gump and Co, an oyster company, and it just takes off and is incredibly successful. And then Jenny is in this book kind of because her spirit visits Forrest a number of times throughout the course of this book, which like I feel neutral on. Like those scenes were fine. But also when he has his oyster company, there's these like rival oyster people who are upset that like Forrest Company is doing so well and is like stealing all of their oysters. And he hires like this guy who had been in the military, and it was a character from the first book as well. Which by the way, so Lieutenant Dan and Sue, he thought that they had stole money from him with Bubba Gump. But then when he runs into them again, he finds out that like they weren't to blame. And it was that chess champion guy from the first book. That's the guy who stole all the money. So he becomes friends with Lieutenant Dan and Sue again. And then all three of them like join the army to fight the war. And that's why all three of them end up being in Baghdad in that tank, which later explodes. But anyway, so when he has his oyster company, these rival guys really are upset with Forrest. And there is this military guy that he has hired to work for Gump and Co. And it is a military guy who had been in the first book as well. But this military guy, he is like in his 50s and he's black. This rival oyster group, they like beat him up and are saying super racist things to him. And so Forrest sees him like in a closet one day really upset, and he's like, well, you know, like what's wrong? And so this guy tells him what had happened. And then Forrest Gump goes out and he beats up these other oyster guys and, you know, like gets payback for his friend. And it is after this event that Little Forrest walks up and he's like, "Are you okay, Dad?" And Forrest is like, "What did you say?" Because Forrest called him Dad and he has never called him that before. And then little Forrest says, "I love you, Dad." And so Forrest Gump is just like, "Oh, he called me Dad and he said he loves me." So it's a big moment for Forrest. But I didn't like this scene because it bothers me when white authors use a scene of racism as a way to show how good their white protagonist is. Like, I'm not saying it can never be done well, but I feel like oftentimes books do this in just such a lazy way, and it just is a pet peeve of mine. And I feel like it was just poorly done, and it's just like using something so serious and hurtful, but it's like not even about the characters of color, right? Like, this scene wasn't even about his friend in the military who was Black. It's all about Forrest, right? Like, that's what this scene is about. It's just like, oh, let's just harass this poor person of color so we can show how good the white person is because he's going to defend him. It just rubs me the wrong way and I don't like it. The same can be said for scenes where like a woman is about to be harassed or raped or something, and then it's used as a way for the man to come in and to save the day, you know? So it's like when they use something that serious, but they don't even make it about the woman or the person of color, they make it about the white person or the man, you know? And so I just don't like when books do that, and I did not think it was well done here, and it just felt, like I said, it was just a scene of racism that was used just for the sake of showing what a great person the white guy is. And something else I want to talk about that I thought was poorly done is there is a scene when he is with Little Forrest in New York City and they're eating at a restaurant that they hear a lot of celebrities go to. And who do they run into but Tom Hanks? And there's no reference to the movie Forrest Gump in this scene, but Tom Hanks, while he's talking to them, he drops a ton of quotes from Forrest Gump during their conversation. One, it was very meta, which I'm fine with things that are meta when they're done well. But this, again, just felt so forced and so contrived, and it wasn't even funny. It was just annoying, and it was just like a very obvious nod to the movie, which, I mean, obviously the movie was super famous, but like that scene, as well as the scene near the end, just made it seem like this book really was just a cash grab. You know, like Winston Groom didn't have this idea already waiting. It was just the movie did really well. So he's like, I guess I'll write a sequel and I better reference the movie a number of times so that people like will like it more, I guess. I don't know. But in the end, after things are all happy and good, he talks about his life being made into a movie. And he says he like goes on Letterman or something. And he says to Letterman, "I need to pee," after Letterman asks him a question. And, you know, it's an awkward silence after he says this. And of course, this is a callback to the first book, because in the first book, he says, "I need to pee," whenever he's asked anything. That comes up all the time. And so I can appreciate the callback to the first book, but then mentioning the movie in this end section, I just didn't like. And again, it was just, I didn't get the point. It felt very unnecessary, very forced. And again, just like Winston Groom, like he's just trying to cater to fans of the movie by writing this book. And so he's like, well, I guess I'll include a scene with Tom Hanks and I'll like mention as if Forrest Gump is a real person and like how would he react to his life being turned into a movie, and I'll have a scene about that too. And yeah, I didn't like it. And overall, like I said, this book was very disappointing because the first book, you know, I will say I did read this quick. I read both books like in 2 days because they are like pacing. It just flies by, like it's one event after the other. So it is one that you can easily read quickly. But having said that, this one, there were moments that I found a little dull. However, there's like so much going on that eventually whatever was boring, we move on to something that's maybe a bit more interesting. But for example, he talks a lot about football in this book, and football came up in Forrest Gump as well, but it comes up at 2 different times here. This is very subjective, but I do not follow football at all, and I don't care about football. And so when he's talking details about these plays and how this works and how that works, I don't care. And so parts that dealt with football I found boring, but also the part when he was like with Saddam Hussein and all the parts in the military, I found those boring as well. And I was just wanting them to move on to the next thing because I don't care about the scene with Saddam Hussein in a tank. And then from there, we go to him playing football in Germany, which again gets more into football talk. And then, yeah, anyway, so there were sections of this book that I was just kind of like, okay, can we hurry and move on? And luckily, like I said, things do move on relatively quickly. He's never anywhere for too long, which also, by the way, when he's in Germany, he meets a woman, Gretchen, I think his name is, and the two of them kind of fall in love. And then she ends up coming to America, I think in the end, like they reconnect in the end when he's successful. And so I think it's implied that they will raise Forrest together or something like that. But also in the first book, Forrest Gump is like an idiot savant is what they call him, where like he's not good at basic things, but then he like understands these intense mathematics that like most people would have no idea, right? And he's really good at chess too, like instantly he just gets chess and he's really good at it. And there is no talk of his like savant ways in this book. So again, I felt like, was that a change that Winston Groom made because of the movie? Because in the movie, we don't hear that Forrest is a savant. And so it seems like he kind of just made Forrest more like the movie Forrest in that sense by not mentioning that aspect of his character at all. And yeah, I guess that wraps it up for my review on Forrest Gump. Those are the basic details of the plot. There might have been a few other random things that happened, but what I mentioned are like the bigger events within this book. And yeah, I'm repeating myself now, but I just was not as entertained. I didn't find it as funny. And there were, a couple cringy moments in Forrest Gump, the first book, but overall I did enjoy it. Whereas that the same cannot be said for Gump and Co though. So unfortunately, I would not recommend this. And yeah, you can tell that this book, like I said, he didn't write this because he actually had an idea for a story. For example, Dr. Sleep by Stephen King is a sequel to The Shining. And you might see that and be like, a sequel to The Shining? Like clearly Stephen King is just wanting to make money off one of his most famous books of all time. And he doesn't actually have an idea. He's just trying to make more money. But then you read Dr. Sleep and it turns out Stephen King actually did have a purpose and an idea. And this wasn't just about making money. He actually had a story to tell about Danny Torrance. And I love Dr. Sleep. It's so good. That is not the case here though. Clearly Winston Groom did not have an actual story or a point he wanted to make. Obviously he's just like, hey, the movie did really well. And maybe his agents, I'm assuming they were telling him to write a sequel too. So it clearly was just about the money when it comes to Gump and Co, in my opinion. So yeah, I guess that wraps it up. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you have read this book or not, and comment any other random thoughts you might have down below. And don't forget to like this video. And as always, share my videos with others if you find them interesting and entertaining enough. And if you have not watched my Forrest Gump video, what are you doing? You definitely should. If you just watched this whole video without watching that one first, kind of doesn't make sense. But nonetheless, I'm not trying to shame you. Just go right on ahead and watch my Forrest Gump video. And yeah, thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. It means so much to me. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I will see you next time. Bye.